Some secrets are written in ink, but others are etched in blood, sacrifice and honor that most people will never understand. What happens when a young woman's past collides with her present in the most unexpected way, turning mockery into stunned silence and transforming doubt into respect? Sometimes the very thing that makes you different is exactly what makes you extraordinary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training grounds of Fort Benning as Sarah Mitchell stepped off the bus with 43 other recruits. At 22, she was neither the youngest nor the oldest, but something about her immediately drew unwanted attention. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, or perhaps it was the intricate tattoo that peeked out from beneath her collar, wrapping around her neck like a delicate piece of art. The drill sergeant's voice boomed across the formation, but Sarah had already tuned into the whispers behind her. She had expected this. The stares, the judgment, the assumptions. What she hadn't expected was how quickly those assumptions would turn into outright hostility. "Look at Princess Tattoo over there," sneered Marcus Chen, a stocky recruit from Texas, who seemed to have appointed himself as the group's unofficial spokesperson. "Bet she thinks this is some kind of fashion show." Sarah kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only made things worse, but she could feel the heat of their stares, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy pack. The first week was brutal, but not in the way Sarah had anticipated. The physical challenges, the sleep deprivation, the constant shouting from drill sergeants, all of that she could handle. What wore on her was the constant stream of comments from her fellow recruits. They questioned everything about her: her motivation for joining, her ability to handle combat, even her right to be there.
"Why don't you just quit now before you embarrass yourself?" asked Jessica Rodriguez during Chow Hall one evening.
Her voice carried just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. This isn't a place for people who think the military is some kind of self-expression experiment. Sarah continued eating her meal, methodically chewing each bite while the conversation around her grew more pointed. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, in high school, in college, even at a civilian job. People saw the tattoo and made assumptions. They saw a young woman trying to look tough, trying to make a statement, trying to rebel against something. If only they knew the truth. The tattoo wasn't a statement or an act of rebellion. It was a memorial, a promise, and a reminder, all wrapped into one intricate design. The black ink formed delicate patterns that seemed almost Celtic in nature, with small symbols woven throughout that held meaning only she fully understood. At first glance, it looked like an artistic choice, something chosen from a book in a tattoo parlor. But each element had been carefully selected, each line representing something precious that had been lost. Training continued with relentless intensity. Every morning began before dawn, with physical training that pushed their bodies to their limits. Sarah consistently performed well, often finishing runs in the top 10 and completing obstacle courses with efficiency that surprised even the drill sergeants. But her competence only seemed to fuel more resentment from her peers. "She's just showing off," muttered David Park during weapons training. "Trying to prove she's better than everyone else because she's got some ink on her neck." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was being criticized for the very thing that had once saved her life and shaped her into the person she was today. But she couldn't explain that to them, couldn't share the story behind the tattoo, without revealing parts of herself she wasn't ready to expose. During their third week, the recruits were introduced to military history and traditions. Colonel James Patterson, a distinguished officer with over 30 years of service, conducted these sessions. He was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of military operations and his ability to spot potential in even the most unlikely recruits. Sarah found these classes to be the only respite from the constant social tension. Here, focused on learning about battles and strategies, the other recruits seemed to forget about their issues with her appearance. She absorbed every detail the colonel shared, asking thoughtful questions and demonstrating a deep understanding of tactical concepts that impressed even the seasoned officer, Mitchell. Colonel Patterson said after one particularly engaging discussion about asymmetric warfare, "You have an interesting perspective on these operations. Have you studied military history before?" "Some, sir," Sarah replied simply, not wanting to elaborate in front of the others. But her knowledge went deeper than casual study. She understood these battles not just as historical events but as real experiences that had shaped real people. She could envision the chaos, the split-second decisions, the weight of responsibility that commanders carried. This understanding came from somewhere personal, somewhere the others couldn't access. The mockery continued through their fourth and fifth weeks. It evolved from simple comments about her appearance to more sophisticated attacks on her character and motivations. Some recruits suggested she was there just to meet military men. Others implied she couldn't handle real combat and would crack under pressure. A few even questioned whether someone with visible tattoos should be representing the military at all. Sarah weathered it all with the same quiet dignity she had maintained since arriving. She focused on her training, excelled in her studies, and gradually earned the grudging respect of some drill sergeants who recognized her dedication and competence. But the social isolation remained constant. During weapons training, she consistently scored among the highest marks. In combat exercises, she demonstrated tactical thinking that surprised instructors. Her physical fitness scores placed her in the top percentile of all recruits. Yet none of this seemed to matter to her peers, who had decided her character based solely on her appearance. "I don't get it," said Jennifer Walsh, one of the few recruits who hadn't actively participated in the harassment, but hadn't defended Sarah either. "She's actually pretty good at all this stuff. Maybe we've been too hard on her." "Don't let her fool you," Marcus responded immediately. "Anyone can memorize some facts and hit some targets. The real test is when things get serious, when lives are on the line. That's when people show who they really are." His words carried more weight than he realized. Sarah had been tested in ways none of them could imagine. She had already faced situations where lives hung in the balance, where split-second decisions mattered, where the difference between success and failure was measured in heartbeats and inches. As their training progressed into more advanced tactical exercises, Sarah's natural leadership abilities began to emerge. During team-based scenarios, she found herself naturally coordinating movements and making strategic decisions that led to successful mission completion. Her fellow recruits began to rely on her tactical insights, even while maintaining their social distance. "She's got good instincts," admitted David Park to his bunk mate after Sarah's team successfully completed a particularly challenging night exercise. "Still don't trust her, but she knows what she's doing out there." The contradiction was becoming more apparent to everyone. Sarah's performance consistently contradicted their assumptions about her character and capabilities. She was proving herself to be exactly the kind of soldier the military needed: intelligent, dedicated, capable under pressure, and committed to the mission above personal recognition. But the tattoo remained a barrier between her and acceptance. Every morning when she dressed, every evening during personal time, every moment when the conversation lulled, eyes would drift to her neck and the assumptions would resurface. The ink that meant everything to her continued to be seen as nothing more than a poor decision or attention-seeking behavior. What none of them realized was that Colonel Patterson had been watching Sarah more closely than the others. Her performance had caught his attention. But there was something else about her that seemed familiar. The way she carried herself, the depth of her military knowledge, the natural command presence she displayed during exercises, it all reminded him of someone from his past. During their 6th week, as the recruits prepared for more advanced training phases, the colonel began to take special notice of Sarah's tattoo. At first, it had simply been another visible marking on another recruit. But something about the specific design, the particular symbols woven throughout the pattern, was triggering memories he couldn't quite place. The stage was being set for a revelation that would change everything. The truth behind Sarah's tattoo wasn't just personal history. It was connected to something much larger, something that would transform not only how her fellow recruits saw her, but how she saw herself and her place in the military tradition she was working so hard to join. As week 7 approached, Sarah continued to excel in training while enduring the social isolation that had become her constant companion. She had no idea that her carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible, or that the mockery she had endured would soon be replaced by something she had never expected: reverence, respect, and the understanding that some stories are too important to remain hidden forever. The tattoo that had made her an outcast was about to reveal her as something far more significant than any of them had imagined. The morning of week 7 brought an unexpected change to their routine. Instead of the usual physical training, the recruits were assembled in the main briefing hall for what Colonel Patterson called a heritage recognition ceremony. None of them had heard of such an event before, and the unusual nature of the gathering created an undercurrent of curiosity and nervousness among the group. Sarah sat in the middle section of the assembled recruits, feeling the familiar weight of stares on the back of her neck. Even during formal military ceremonies, her fellow soldiers couldn't seem to forget about her tattoo. She had grown accustomed to the whispers, but today something felt different. Colonel Patterson seemed more focused, more intentional in his movements as he prepared to address the group. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, Today, we're going to discuss something that goes beyond standard military protocol. We're going to talk about sacrifice, legacy, and the ways that service members honor those who came before them. The recruits shifted in their seats, uncertain where this was heading. Sarah felt a strange flutter in her stomach, though she couldn't identify why this particular speech was affecting her differently than others. In the military, we carry our history with us in many ways, Colonel Patterson continued. Through traditions, through stories, through ceremonies that connect us to those who served before us. But sometimes, that history is carried in more personal, more intimate ways. His eyes scanned the room, and Sarah felt them linger on her for just a moment longer than the others. She told herself it was her imagination, but something in his expression seemed almost recognition. I want to tell you about a mission that took place 15 years ago in Afghanistan, the colonel said, clicking to the first slide of a presentation none of them had expected. It was designated Operation Sanctuary, and it involved a small unit tasked with evacuating civilians from a compound that had come under siege by insurgent forces. Even the recruits who had been whispering moments before were now focused entirely on the colonel's words. Sarah felt her heartbeat beginning to accelerate, though she couldn't explain why this particular story was affecting her so strongly. The unit was led by Captain Rebecca Mitchell, Colonel Patterson continued, and Sarah's world suddenly tilted on its axis. She was 28 years old, a decorated officer with multiple tours of duty, and a tactical mind that had earned the respect of everyone who served with her. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Mitchell. Her mother's name, her mother's rank, her mother's age at the time of that mission. Suddenly the room felt impossibly small, the air too thin to breathe properly. She gripped the edges of her seat, trying to maintain her composure while her mind raced through the implications. Captain Mitchell's unit included 8 soldiers, all volunteers for this particularly dangerous mission, the colonel continued, seemingly unaware of the emotional earthquake he had just triggered in one of his recruits. The civilian compound housed 37 people, including 12 children, who were trapped by insurgent forces that had surrounded the area. Sarah's vision began to blur slightly as memories she had tried to suppress came flooding back. Her mother's deployment, the phone calls that became less frequent, the official visit that changed everything. She had been only 7 years old, but some memories burn themselves into your consciousness so deeply that time cannot erode them. The mission required innovative tactics, Colonel Patterson explained, showing tactical maps on the screen. Captain Mitchell developed an approach that used the terrain to create multiple extraction points, allowing the civilians to be evacuated in smaller groups to reduce risk. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Marcus Chen, who had been Sarah's most persistent tormentor, leaned forward in his seat. Sir, did the mission succeed? The colonel paused, and Sarah saw something flicker across his expression. Pain, perhaps. Or regret. The mission was a complete success in terms of its primary objective. All 37 civilians were evacuated safely. Not a single non-combatant was injured during the operation. But, sir? Jennifer Walsh asked, picking up on something in the colonel's tone. What about the soldiers? Colonel Patterson took a deep breath. Captain Mitchell's unit came under heavy fire during the final extraction phase. They held their position to ensure the last group of civilians could reach safety. In doing so, they saved dozens of lives at the cost of their own. The room was completely silent now. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought them back with every ounce of strength she possessed. She couldn't break down now, not in front of everyone. Not when she was finally learning details about her mother's final mission that had been classified for years. All 8 members of Captain Mitchell's unit were killed in action that day, the colonel continued, his voice heavy with respect and sorrow. They were posthumously awarded the Silver Star for their extraordinary heroism. Captain Mitchell herself received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. Sarah's hands were shaking now, despite her efforts to maintain control. She pressed them firmly against her thighs, hoping no one would notice her emotional state. But the weight of finally knowing the truth about her mother's death was overwhelming. Why are you telling us this story, sir? Asked David Park. Because, Colonel Patterson replied, these stories matter. These sacrifices matter. And sometimes, the legacy of these heroes continues in ways we don't immediately recognize. He paused again, and this time Sarah was certain he was looking directly at her. Captain Rebecca Mitchell left behind a 7-year-old daughter named Sarah. After her mother's death, that little girl was raised by her grandmother, who told her stories about her mother's service, but kept many of the details classified until Sarah was old enough to understand them. The room erupted in gasps and turned heads as dozens of pairs of eyes suddenly focused on Sarah with complete shock. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her carefully constructed walls had just been demolished in front of everyone. "Sarah Mitchell," Colonel Patterson said directly, "would you please stand?" Sarah's legs felt like water, but somehow she managed to rise from her seat. The room was spinning slightly, and she could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears above the complete silence of her fellow recruits. "I've been wondering since your first week here why your tactical knowledge seemed so advanced, why your leadership instincts were so natural, and why something about you seemed familiar," the colonel said gently. "Yesterday, I finally placed where I had seen that tattoo before." Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her neck, covering the ink that had been the source of so much ridicule and judgment. "I served with your mother for 2 years before her final deployment," Colonel Patterson explained. "She had identical tattoo in the same location. She told me it was a family tradition, passed down from military ancestors, each generation adding their own elements to honor those who came before." The truth hit the room like a bomb. Sarah's tattoo wasn't a fashion statement or an act of rebellion. It was a memorial, a military tradition, a sacred connection to generations of service members who had sacrificed for their country. "Your mother was one of the finest officers I ever had the privilege of serving with," the colonel continued, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "She was brilliant, fearless, and completely dedicated to protecting others, even at the cost of her own life. And if the past 7 weeks have shown me anything, it's that she passed those qualities on to her daughter." Marcus Chen, who had been the most vocal in his criticism of Sarah, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His face had gone completely pale, and he seemed unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Around the room, other recruits were experiencing similar reactions as the full weight of their behavior towards Sarah became clear. "I owe you an apology," Colonel Patterson said directly to Sarah. "I should have recognized the significance of your tattoo sooner. I should have realized who you were. Your mother would be incredibly proud of the soldier you're becoming." Sarah finally lost her battle with the tears. They came silently at first, just small streams down her cheeks, but the emotion she had been suppressing for weeks finally overwhelmed her defenses. She stood there in front of 43 other recruits, crying not from shame or embarrassment, but from a complex mixture of grief, pride, and relief. "Sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never wanted special treatment. I just wanted to serve like she did." "And you are," Colonel Patterson replied firmly. "Every day, in every exercise, in every challenge you've faced here, you've been serving with honor just as she did." The room remained silent as the full implications of this revelation settled over everyone. Sarah wasn't just another recruit with questionable judgment about tattoos. She was the daughter of a war hero, carrying on a family tradition of military service that stretched back generations. Her tattoo wasn't a decoration, it was a sacred memorial to those who had died in service to their country. Jessica Rodriguez, who had been particularly cruel in her comments about Sarah's appearance, suddenly understood the magnitude of her mistake. She was staring at someone whose mother had died saving civilians, whose tattoo honored that sacrifice, whose quiet dignity in the face of mockery now seemed incredibly heroic rather than simply stubborn. The tattoo, Colonel Patterson explained to the group, contains symbols representing each family member who died in military service. The central design honors Captain Mitchell specifically, but there are elements representing her grandfather who died in Vietnam, her great-uncle who was killed in Korea, and her great-great-grandfather who died in World War II. Sarah's tattoo, which had been seen as evidence of poor judgment or attention-seeking behavior, was actually a deeply meaningful tribute to multiple generations of ultimate sacrifice. Each element that her fellow recruits had dismissed as artistic flourish was actually a memorial to a specific person who had died serving their country. "I want each of you to think carefully about what happened here," Colonel Patterson addressed the entire group. "You made assumptions about one of your fellow soldiers based solely on appearance. You questioned her character, her motivations, and her right to be here, all without knowing anything about her background or her reasons for serving." The weight of shame was visible on faces throughout the room. These recruits, who had spent weeks believing they were superior to Sarah, were now confronting the reality that they had been mocking the daughter of a war hero, someone whose family had sacrificed more for their country than most people could imagine. But more importantly, the colonel continued, despite facing constant criticism and social isolation, Sarah continued to excel in training, to support her fellow recruits in exercises, and to conduct herself with the kind of dignity and professionalism that would make her mother proud. David Park, who had questioned Sarah's ability to handle pressure, now realized he had been watching someone who had been handling pressure with extraordinary grace for weeks. She had faced their harassment with quiet strength, proving her character through actions rather than words. "Sarah, Colonel Patterson said, turning back to her. I have something that belongs to you. He reached into his briefer and pulled out a folded American flag, the kind given to families of fallen soldiers. But this one was different. Sarah could see immediately that it had been carried, used, cherished, rather than simply stored as a memorial. Your mother carried this flag on every mission during her final deployment, he explained. It was in her equipment when she died. The Army kept it with her classified files, waiting for the day when you would be old enough and cleared to receive it. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the flag. This wasn't just any memorial flag. It was one her mother had carried into combat, a tangible connection to her service and sacrifice. The weight of it seemed to contain all the history, all the love, all the pride and sorrow she had carried for 15 years. There's something else, Colonel Patterson said softly. Your mother left a letter for you, to be delivered if you ever chose to follow in her footsteps and join the military. The room held its breath as he handed Sarah a sealed envelope, her mother's handwriting clearly visible on the front. Her name, written in the familiar script she remembered from birthday cards and school notes, but never again after that terrible day when she was 7. Sarah looked around the room at faces that had shown her nothing but contempt for weeks and now reflected shock, shame, and dawning respect. Marcus Chen looked as if he wanted to disappear entirely. Jessica Rodriguez had tears in her own eyes. Even the recruits who had remained neutral were clearly struggling with the revelation of how wrong their assumptions had been. But Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: forgiveness. These people had judged her based on limited information and cultural biases, but they were young soldiers in training, just as she was. They had made mistakes, but those mistakes didn't define them any more than her tattoo should have defined her. The revelation had changed everything. But Sarah realized that her mother's letter and flag weren't the most important things she was receiving that day. She was finally getting something she had never thought to hope for: understanding, respect, and the knowledge that her mother's sacrifice had meaning that extended far beyond what she had previously known. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the empty chapel on base, her mother's letter unopened in her hands, and the flag folded carefully beside her. The revelations of the day had left her emotionally drained, but also strangely at peace. For the first time since arriving at boot camp, she didn't feel the weight of hostile stares or whispered judgments. The chapel door opened softly, and she turned to see Marcus Chen standing hesitantly in the doorway. The young man who had been her most vocal critic looked smaller somehow, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort and shame. "Can I talk to you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible in the sacred space. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the pew beside her. Marcus approached slowly, as if afraid she might change her mind and send him away. When he sat down, he kept a respectful distance, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't even know where to start," he said, staring straight ahead at the simple altar. "I've been sitting in my bunk for hours, trying to figure out what to say, and nothing seems big enough for what I did." Sarah remained silent, giving him space to work through his thoughts. She had learned patience from her grandmother, who had taught her that sometimes the most important conversations required time to unfold naturally. "I made assumptions about you from the first day," Marcus continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I saw your tattoo and decided you were just trying to be different, trying to get attention. I never considered that it might mean something important." "Why did it bother you so much?" Sarah asked gently. She wasn't angry anymore. She was genuinely curious about what had driven such persistent hostility. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with something personal. "My older brother got a bunch of tattoos when he was 18, he finally said. Started hanging around with the wrong crowd, got into drugs, completely threw his life away. When I saw your tattoo, I guess I just assumed you were going down the same path." Sarah nodded, beginning to understand. "You were trying to protect the military from someone you thought didn't belong." "That's what I told myself," Marcus admitted. "But looking back, I think I was just scared. Scared that if the military started accepting people who looked different, people like my brother might find ways to get in and mess things up for everyone else." The honesty in his admission surprised Sarah. She had expected an apology, but this level of self-reflection showed a maturity she hadn't anticipated from someone who had seemed so closed-minded. "Your brother's choices weren't about his tattoos," Sarah said softly. "Just like my choices aren't about mine. The ink doesn't make the person." "I know that now," Marcus replied, finally turning to look at her. "I've watched you for 7 weeks, and you've been everything I thought the military needed. Dedicated, skilled, professional. I was so focused on judging your appearance that I missed seeing your character." Other recruits began filtering into the chapel, drawn perhaps by the same need for quiet reflection that had brought Sarah there. Jessica Rodriguez entered first, followed by David Park, then Jennifer Walsh. Within minutes, nearly half their training platoon had gathered, all looking uncertain but determined. "We all owe you an apology," Jessica said, speaking for the group. "We treated you terribly, and there's no excuse for it." Sarah looked around at these faces that had shown her nothing but hostility for weeks. Now she saw something different. Genuine remorse, respect, and something that might even become friendship given time. "I forgive you," she said simply, and meant it. "We all made mistakes. I could have tried harder to connect with you instead of just focusing on getting through training." "No," David Park interrupted firmly. "You don't get to take responsibility for our behavior. You handled everything we threw at you with more grace than any of us deserved." Today the group fell into a contemplative silence, each person processing the events of the day and their role in creating the hostile environment Sarah had endured. The weight of their collective shame was palpable, but so was their determination to make amends. "Tell us about your mother," Jennifer Walsh said quietly. "If you want to. We'd like to know about the person behind that tattoo." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. These were the first words of genuine interest in her personal life that any of them had spoken. She thought about her mother, about the stories her grandmother had shared, about the woman she had only known for 7 precious years. "She was funny," Sarah began, smiling at the memory. "Really funny in ways that surprised people. She could do this impression of our grumpy neighbor that would make me laugh until my stomach hurt. But when she put on her uniform, she became someone different. More serious, more focused." The recruits listened intently as Sarah shared memories, her mother teaching her to tie knots using kitchen string, the way she would practice tactical movements in their backyard while grilling dinner, the bedtime stories that were often modified versions of famous military battles. "She never talked about combat directly," Sarah explained. "But she taught me that being strong meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. She said the military wasn't about fighting. It was about making sure other people didn't have to." As Sarah talked, the other recruits began to see not just the daughter of a war hero, but a person with depth, humor, and genuine care for others. They started to understand that her quiet dignity during their harassment hadn't been arrogance or aloofness. It had been strength born from real loss and genuine conviction. "What does the tattoo mean exactly?" Marcus asked, his curiosity now respectful rather than judgmental. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her neck. "Each symbol represents someone from my family who died in service. The central design is for my mother, but there are others. My great-great-grandfather died at Normandy. My great-uncle was killed in Korea. My grandfather died in Vietnam." She traced the patterns with her finger as she spoke, each symbol suddenly meaningful to the group watching her. What had appeared to be decorative flourishes were actually memorial elements, each one representing a life given in service to others. "The tradition is that each generation adds to the design," Sarah continued. "When someone in our family joins the military, they get the existing tattoo as a way of carrying our history with them. If they die in service, their symbol gets added for the next generation." The profound meaning behind what they had dismissed as a fashion statement hit the group with renewed force. Sarah wasn't just wearing art, she was carrying the memory of multiple generations of sacrifice. "Will you add to it?" Jessica asked softly. "Only if I die in service," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "The tattoo is for honoring the dead, not the living. If I survive my military career, I'll pass it on to the next generation unchanged." The casual way she discussed the possibility of dying in service demonstrated a level of acceptance and commitment that impressed everyone present. This wasn't someone playing at being a soldier. This was someone who understood the potential cost of service and had chosen it anyway. Over the following days, the dynamic in their training unit shifted dramatically. The recruits who had mocked Sarah now went out of their way to include her in conversations, to seek her tactical insights during exercises, and to demonstrate their newfound respect through actions rather than words. But the change went deeper than simple guilt-driven courtesy. As they got to know Sarah as a person rather than judging her based on appearance, they discovered someone genuinely worth knowing. Her dry sense of humor, her encyclopedic knowledge of military history, her instinctive understanding of team dynamics, and her unwavering commitment to excellence made her a natural leader. Colonel Patterson watched this transformation with satisfaction. He had seen similar situations before, where assumptions and prejudices created unnecessary barriers between soldiers who needed to work together. But he had also seen something special in Sarah from the beginning, something that reminded him powerfully of her mother. During their 8th week of training, Sarah finally opened her mother's letter. She had waited wanting to be in the right emotional space to receive whatever final message her mother had left for her. The letter was longer than she had expected, written in her mother's familiar handwriting on military letterhead. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have chosen to follow a path similar to mine, and it means I am not there to guide you through it. I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not for joining the military, but for having the courage to choose your own way in life." The letter went on to describe her mother's hopes for Sarah's future, her pride in the young woman she was becoming, and her understanding that military service would bring both honor and hardship. But what struck Sarah most was a section near the end. "You will face people who judge you before they know you. You will encounter those who question your motivations, your capabilities, and your right to be there. Do not let their limitations become yours. Prove yourself through actions, show your character through consistency, and remember that the opinions of others cannot diminish your worth unless you allow them to." Reading those words, Sarah realized her mother had somehow anticipated exactly the situation she had faced during boot camp. The advice felt like a direct response to the past 7 weeks of her life. "I hope you will find brothers and sisters in arms who see your heart rather than your appearance," the letter continued. "And if you don't find them immediately, be patient. Sometimes the best friendships are forged in the crucible of shared challenge and mutual respect, earned over time." Sarah finished reading. She felt a profound sense of connection to her mother and to the military tradition she was joining. The letter wasn't just personal advice. It was a bridge between generations of service members who had faced similar challenges and emerged stronger. The final weeks of boot camp passed in a blur of intensive training and growing camaraderie. The group that had once been divided by prejudice and misunderstanding had transformed into a cohesive unit. Sarah found herself naturally taking on leadership roles, not through assertion or demand, but through competence and the quiet confidence that had always been part of her character. On graduation day, as the new soldiers stood in formation for their final ceremony, Colonel Patterson addressed the assembled recruits and their families. But his words seemed directed particularly at Sarah's unit. "You have learnt many things during your time here," he said. "You have learned to march, to shoot, to think tactically, and to work as a team. But perhaps the most important lesson you have learned is this: your strength as soldiers comes not from your individual capabilities, but from your ability to see the worth in each other, and to unite that worth in service of something greater than yourselves." Sarah stood at attention, her dress uniform pressed and perfect, her bearing reflecting months of training and a lifetime of understanding what it meant to serve. The tattoo that had once marked her as an outsider was now covered by her uniform collar, but she knew it was still there, still carrying the memory of those who had gone before. Marcus Chen stood 2 positions to her left in formation, and she could see from his posture and expression how much he had changed since that first day. The angry, judgmental young man had become someone capable of growth, empathy, and genuine leadership. Jessica Rodriguez stood to her right, no longer the person who had questioned Sarah's right to be there, but someone who had learned to see strength in many forms. After the ceremony, as families gathered to celebrate with their newly graduated soldiers, Sarah stood alone for a moment, holding her mother's flag and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. She had expected boot camp to be challenging physically and mentally, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional and social challenges that had tested her in different ways. "Sarah," a voice called, and she turned to see her entire training unit approaching. Marcus carried a small wrapped package, and his expression was serious but warm. "We wanted to give you something," Jessica said, speaking for the group. "Something to show you what you mean to us now." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden display case, sized perfectly for folding an American flag. But what made it special were the engravings covering its surface. The names and ranks of her mother, and all the family members represented in her tattoo, along with the dates of their service and sacrifice. "We researched your family's military history," David Park explained. "We wanted to create something worthy of honoring their memory and your service." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she traced the engraved names with her finger. This wasn't just a gift. It was recognition, respect, and understanding made tangible. It was proof that the people who had once mocked her had truly seen and valued who she was. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you could possibly know." "We know we can't undo the way we treated you at first," Marcus said solemnly, "but we want you to know that we see you now. We see your strength, your character, and your heart. We see the soldier your mother would be proud of." As Sarah looked at the faces surrounding her, she realized that boot camp had given her something she hadn't expected. Not just military training, but a family of choice. People who had learned to see past surface appearances, to recognize the worth of a person's character and commitment. The young woman who had stepped off the bus 7 weeks earlier, prepared to endure mockery and isolation in service of her country and her family's legacy, was now surrounded by people who understood both her sacrifice and her strength. The tattoo that had marked her as different had become a bridge to deeper understanding and genuine respect. Colonel Patterson watched from a distance as Sarah and her unit shared this moment of reconciliation and mutual appreciation. He thought about her mother, about the mission that had cost Rebecca Mitchell her life, and about the daughter who was now carrying that legacy forward in her own way. The mucking had stopped the moment the truth was revealed, but the respect Sarah had earned would last far beyond boot camp. She had proven that strength comes not from how others see you, but from how you see yourself and how you choose to respond to challenge. Her mother's sacrifice had given meaning to her life, but her own choices had given meaning to her mother's sacrifice. As the newly graduated soldiers prepared to head to their first duty assignments, Sarah knew she carried with her more than just her family's military tradition. She carried the knowledge that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome through patience, consistency, and the courage to remain true to yourself in the face of adversity. The tattoo on her neck would always be there, a permanent reminder of those who had gone before. But now it represented something more, the bridge between past and future, between loss and purpose, between judgment and understanding. Sometimes the very thing that makes you different is exactly what makes you extraordinary. They mocked her at boot camp, until the colonel went white at her neck tattoo.